Welcome back to my channel, Beautiful Minutia. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany, and today I am doing one of my favorite videos that I do every year for the 12 days of Christmas. I am ranking all of the classics that I read in 2024, and there's a lot of them. I read quite a few classics. In 2024, I read close to 50 classics, and I'm going to be talking about all of them here very, very briefly. This is mostly for ranking, so I'm not going to share in-depth thoughts, but I do want to let you know that in this ranking, I always include rereads, and so this is a really fun place for me to include that because some of my favorite books that I read this year were rereads, and I don't include that when I'm talking about like my top books of the year. So it's really, really nice to have a place that I can talk about some of the rereads that I enjoyed this year. I also include short stories and novellas in this. So if my total seems especially impressive, just know that some of these are very short. I'm going to start at the bottom and work my way up to the top. But before I get into like the full ranking of them, I do want to mention just a couple of books that I did start this year, but I didn't finish. One of them is a soft DNF, and that one is Moby Dick. If you saw my 40 by 40 list, you know that I am intending to read this book before I turn 40, but I did have to DNF it this year because I just had so many commitments and it just really wasn't working out. I also DNF'd The Food of the Gods by H.G. Wells. It was my intention to come back and finish this by the end of the year. I started it during October, but I just really didn't want to because it was really tapering off for me. I think I made it 3/4 of the way through. It wasn't a bad book, but it just really wasn't working for me at the time I was trying to read it. And lastly is one that I will also return to because it is a short story collection. So that's The October Country by Ray Bradbury. Actually really enjoyed what I read of this and hoped to pick it up again in subsequent Octobers and just read a few short stories during the month rather than sitting down and trying to read all of it, which was my original intent, but I think it worked out well for me to read like 4 or 5 of them and to read more next time. Okay, let's start at the bottom. Some of these will be maybe ones you've heard me talk about already because some of the ones at the bottom did make it into my most disappointing books of the year, just like some of the ones in the very top made it into my top of the year. So my very least favorite classic that I read this year is The Tale of Genji. I just found this to be really long, really drawn out, and really boring and frustrating at many points. So I wish that I had read a nonfiction about this time period in Japan rather than dedicating 3 months of my life to reading this. Next, we have Three Men on the Bummel. Oh my gosh. I loved Three Men on a Boat, but this just was not it. I found myself being bored during the entirety of this, and I was wondering if it was my mood, but the people who I read it with also said it really did not live up to the first book. Also close to the bottom is The Inheritance by Louise May Alcott. This was our group read for Alcott April, and I found myself incredibly bored by how flat and lifeless these characters were. To be fair, she wrote it when she was only 17 years old, but there's a reason that it wasn't published in her lifetime. Hi, editing Tiffany here, and I'm going to be popping in a couple of times throughout this video because apparently I forgot not just 1, not just 2, but 4 books in the course of this video. I don't know how I did that. Actually, I kind of do. I had one list where I put all of the books that I read and kind of like crossed things out and moved them around. And then I had a neater list where I had them all ranked. And I didn't use the neater list. I forgot that I had made a nicer list. So I think that that's how some of them fell in the cracks. But the next book that is on here is actually Lady Susan. You'll already know that I was fairly disappointed by this, partly because it was epistolary, partly because it was too short, and partly because I just was not invested in the drama at all. Next, we have Oblomov, which I don't think was really a bad book. It was just way too long. If this had been 200 to 300 pages, I actually think I would have liked it. Next, we have The Belton Estate, which was my 3rd attempt at a Trollope novel, and it went better than the first 2, but I didn't really feel attached to any of the characters, so I kind of didn't care very much about what happened to them. Next, we have How Do You Live, which is a Japanese children's classic, which I was anticipating to be much more of a coming-of-age story, and the interjections of letters of life lessons from the main character's uncle just made it kind of feel moralizing and preachy to me. Next is The Keeper of the Bees by Jean Stratton Porter. This had marvelous nature writing, but the entire book was kind of just brought down by the romance, which was so unrealistic and honestly really weird. Next, we have The Pickwick Papers. Can you believe I have a Charles Dickens this far down? At this point, we're getting into books that weren't bad books, but I didn't love them. So this is my least favorite Dickens that I've read so far. It's like really, really long. It's super episodic. Moments are really funny, but overall I found it to be pretty forgettable. Next we have Bread Givers, which is a historical classic. And this had some really interesting snippets of Jewish life, and I really enjoyed it, but I don't think it's been overly memorable for me. Next up is Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. This book was really funny in places, really odd in other places, and like very not understandably scientific to me in other places, which it is a sci-fi, so that's fair. But I enjoyed it. I have all the other books in the series. I might continue on at some point, but I'm not overly invested. Next we have That Was Then, This Is Now. This is a companion novel to The Outsiders. And this book actually did make me emotional in places, but I actually can't remember hardly anything about the plot, so it certainly was not one that had the same staying power that The Outsiders did. Next we had Cranford, which is my second Gaskell that I've read, and I thought it was fine. We're in the point where these are books that I did like, but I just found it also to be relatively forgettable. There are moments of humor, and it's a nice cozy read, but nothing revolutionary. At this point, we are firmly in the 4-star categories, just so you know, so I really did actually enjoy a lot of these books, a lot. I reread Hamlet this year with my daughter during homeschool, and it was an interesting experience. I did still like it, but it's definitely not a favorite Shakespeare of mine. Next, we have The Red and the Black, which is my first Stendhal. This is a book that I really thought a lot about while I was reading and was really interesting and made me want to read more Stendhal. I'm back again. The next one is Christmas at Thompson Hall by Anthony Trollope. This is actually the most successful Trollope I have ever read. I actually really enjoyed it. It's a short story or novella. It's somewhere in that range. And it was just perfectly cozy for Christmas and absolutely hilarious. So it might be that Trollope works better for me in a short format. Next, we have Nathaniel Hawthorne's short story collection that I read. I could have ranked these short stories individually, but since I completed it, I'm putting them all together. There were some of these that I absolutely loved, like, oh my goodness, like adored some of these. So I think Hawthorne's short story format works better for me than his novels. Next, we have A Murder is Announced by Agatha Christie. This is actually the only Agatha Christie I read this year, but it was one of the few of hers that I hadn't read yet. So I really enjoyed this. I really enjoyed trying to solve it. And I actually did. I figured out who did it, and I'm very proud of that. Next, we have The Trumpet Major by Thomas Hardy. I adored almost all of this book. The ending brought it down for me a little bit, but the ending wasn't so disappointing that it ruined it for me, because overall I just really loved so much about this book. I loved the beautiful writing. I loved the humor sprinkled throughout, and definitely enjoyed a lot of the characters. Next, we have The Double by Dostoevsky. This is a novella, very, very interesting, about a man who sees his doppelganger, and oh my goodness, I was just like really intrigued by it. Next, we have Dead Souls. I loved the first part of this. In my opinion, there shouldn't even be a second part because Gogol never finished a second part. He kept like throwing out and burning manuscripts, and so we just have little bits and pieces of the manuscript, so it's not a cohesive story at all. But I wish he had finished this. I think he intended for it to be a trilogy. Next, we have The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which I reread this year for my British literature class that I am teaching. And I think I liked it even more the second time, because the first time I read it, I was expecting there to be a lot of details that I didn't know about, because there's been so many adaptations and it's so influential in pop culture. But there wasn't a whole lot of like extra information because it is a novella. It's really, really short. I think I was able to see how much more masterfully it was done the second time reading this. And I had some really amazing conversations with my students. And I think that that also elevated the experience of reading this book. Next, we have The Blue Castle by Ellen Montgomery. I really, really enjoyed reading this for the first time. It's not a 5-star. I was hoping that it would be. And I think it's because the beginning of this book was actually quite irritating to me, and I did not sympathize with the main character very much at all. I just found myself being kind of frustrated with her. But it got better for me, and I thought that the second half was really, really beautifully done, and I ended up really enjoying it. Next, we have Poor Miss Finch, and this is a very different Wilkie Collins. It's not very sensational. It's not very gripping, but it does have so much humor, and that was what was really redeeming for me. It has just really interesting and quirky characters that I was very, very interested to either read from their perspective or just see how they come into the narrative. Next, we have The Vicar of Wakefield. This is such a sweet book, which also has some humor to it, but my favorite part of it was the family dynamics between the vicar and his family as they fall on hard times, and it just feels like bad thing after bad thing after bad thing happens to them. I think this would have made it into my favorites of the year if it didn't have such a contrived ending. Next, we have Nine Coaches Waiting by Mary Stewart. This is like a gothic mystery, which feels very similar to Daphne du Maurier to me, even though I like du Maurier better. It's really interesting because you'll see that there are quite a few other books that were first-time reads for me this year that rank higher on this list than Nine Coaches Waiting, but they didn't make it into my top 12 of the year. The reason for that is that while I really, really loved Nine Coaches Waiting and I was so enthralled with it, I don't think it's a literary masterpiece the way that some of these others are. I think that there are other ones that have more literary merit. This was just a really fun book. So I wanted to have it in my top books of the year, but I don't think it really deserves to be like super, super high on this list. So I don't know if that makes sense or not, but that's my reasoning why there are other books that I ranked higher in this list, but yet they didn't make it into my top books of the year. Next is Dandelion Wine. I am becoming such a Ray Bradbury fangirly, and I truly loved this book, but there were things about it that I didn't love. It didn't have the same impact and effect on me that Something Wicked This Way Comes did, but I still just like really, really enjoyed the themes that Bradbury was exploring here. And there are just some beautiful quotes throughout that really were lovely. I reread A Christmas Carol this year for my British literature class as well. And man, it's just so beautiful. And actually, I'm still kind of like in the 4-star category, but I'm close to 5 stars at this point. I did actually give A Christmas Carol 5 stars because I think it deserves it because of what a lovely story it is, but also the long-lasting cultural impact that A Christmas Carol has had. Next, we have The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe. This was a reread for me, and I reread it in conjunction with What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher, which did make it into my top books of the year. I read The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte this year, and because Agnes Grey was my favorite fictional read of 2023, I had high hopes that The Tenant of Wildfell Hall would make it into my top books of 2024. Unfortunately, that was not to be. It didn't elicit quite the same feelings that Agnes Grey did, but I think that it was so well written. It's really gripping and is quite a brave book for Anne to tackle the topics and the things that she did in the time period that she did. So I think it's a really important book, and I'm so glad that I read it, but it wasn't quite 5 stars for me. Editing Tiffany once again. I also reread The Hobbit with my British literature class this year and with my daughter. So we read them at the same time, so I didn't read it twice. I only read it once. And you might be surprised that it's this far down because I really do love The Hobbit, but it's not like a favorite of all time for me, even though I really enjoy it and I find it really cozy and I like the story as a whole. It's just not as impactful for me as the other Tolkien works that I have read. And so while I really love The Hobbit, it's not a favorite in the same way that some of the others on this list are. I reread Macbeth with my daughter for school also, and I loved it. This was one that I was like, oh man, it's one of my favorite Shakespeare plays. It's so dark and eerie and gripping, and it is actually my daughter's favorite and has been for several years. Okay, I think this is the last time Editing Tiffany is butting in. But I can't believe I forgot to mention the importance of being earnest, especially because it was a favorite of the year. So I don't know how that fell through the cracks, but this was my first Oscar Wilde play, and it was hilarious, and I loved it a whole bunch, and I can't wait to read more Oscar Wilde plays. Next, we have Willa Cather's 5 Stories collection. Some of these short stories I absolutely loved, and maybe I would have been better served to have split them up in this ranking so you could see where they fall. But again, this was a short story collection that I completed in its entirety, so I'm keeping them together. My favorite from this was definitely Neighbor Rozaki, but there were several others that I really, really enjoyed, and there was one that I really did not enjoy. Another book that I reread with my British literature class this year is Animal Farm, and I think that this is such a perfect book. It elicited some amazing conversations in our class, and we just really, really loved reading this together, talking about it together. So I loved it the first time that I read it, but I loved it even more this time because of the discussions that it garnered, and I'm about to reread it again with my daughter for our homeschool, and I can't wait. Another book that I read for homeschooling, what was a reread, was Oliver Twist. This is my daughter's first Dickens, and I read it aloud to her, and it was phenomenal, even better than I remembered from the first time reading it, and I gave it 5 stars then, and I gave it 5 stars now. It felt like a really good introduction for her. She was greatly moved and gripped by the story, and now she likes Charles Dickens too, so this mama's heart is very happy. Next, we have The Secret Agent by Joseph Conrad. I did talk about this in my favorites of the year, and it definitely deserves to be there. This is one that is just so deeply psychological and studying the motivations and thoughts of people, and yeah, it just is one that I still think about all the time, and I read it 6 months ago. We're coming into the top 10. So some of these books were on my best books of the year, but a lot of them are rereads. So first we have The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, which was a reread, but the last time I read it was in high school. So there was a lot I did not remember about it. And this was just such an incredible story of resilience of these people who are leaving Oklahoma during the Dust Bowl and traveling to California for better work opportunities. And it is devastating, the blow after blow after blow that they receive, and yet they retained so much optimism and strength. And it was a really powerful book. Next, we have My Antonia by Willa Cather. She's definitely become a favorite author for me. And so far, My Antonia is my favorite of her works that I have read. It's just such a beautiful story of what home really means and how our roots shape us. But the nature writing is absolutely beautiful, and it makes me want to visit the Nebraskan prairie. I reread Pride and Prejudice this year, and it's just as wonderful as ever. It's actually not my favorite Jane Austen work, but it's still so solidly a 5-star book. And it was lovely because I got to reread it with my book club. And most of the people in our book club had previously read it, but we had a couple of people that it was their first time reading it, and several people that it was their very first Jane Austen. So it was really fun to see their initial responses and to see how they reacted to reading this book for the first time. Next, we have a couple of books that I feel like I could flip-flop these depending on the day. But for today, I'm going to say that the next book is David Copperfield. This was my third Dickens reread this year. Not my third time reading this year, but the third Dickens that I reread this year, which is just crazy because my typical plan is to read a new Dickens every year and reread one. But the way it worked out this year, I reread 3. So at the beginning of the year, I planned to read The Pickwick Papers and reread David Copperfield. But then Oliver Twist happened for school and A Christmas Carol happened for my British literature class. So it just worked out that I read 3 of them. And David Copperfield was one I had not reread since I was either a teenager or a young adult. I actually don't remember. So there was a lot of the plot points that I had forgotten. This was such an impactful book, and I cried multiple times reading this book. I was so powerful, so beautiful. Moments were so sad, but there was also some really great Dickens humor mixed in. I feel like David Copperfield is certainly one of his masterpieces. Next is Kristen Lavrenstatter, which is such a dark book because it so deeply examines sin and the consequences of sin, the long-lasting consequences of sin in Kristen's life when we start with her as a small child and follow her throughout the entirety of her life. And it's just very deeply powerful, but it also is quite melancholy. And it's one that has really deeply impacted me, and I think is one that I will continue to think about for a very long time. The next book is Daniel Deronda, which you will know is my favorite fictional read of 2024. So it's no surprise that it's so high up in this list, but I do have some rereads that I loved more than it. But I really loved Daniel Deronda. Again, deeply thought-provoking, very emotional book for me that I cried multiple times. Moments of sadness, moments of beauty, really well fleshed out characters that you sometimes root for and sometimes hate and go back and forth between those things. And Eliot just does that so perfectly. Number 4 is Crime and Punishment. And this is one of my favorite books of all time, if not my very favorite book of all time. So you may be surprised that there's some books ahead of this, but it's really hard. Again, this is one of those things where I think that I could change this, maybe depending on the day. But Crime and Punishment is just so marvelous. This was my third time reading it, and it was really wonderful to have a group of us reading it on my Discord and be able to chat about reading it together. And for some people, it was a first time read, and for some people, it was a reread, and it was just really wonderful. I just love this book, even though it definitely has some brutal moments, and there's definitely some moments where it feels like a fever dream because you're following a man who is an axe murderer and kind of like what his motivations are and him kind of examining himself. And so it's not a whodunit, it's a why did he do it? And it's deeply reflective in philosophy and morals and religion, and it's just such a fascinating book. The last three books all go together because they're part of the same trilogy, and I could have just grouped them as one, but I wanted to kind of also rank that. So I reread The Lord of the Rings with my Patreon at the beginning of 2024. It was such a beautiful reading experience, and I think that that's why it makes it higher than Crime and Punishment, even though maybe I would say Crime and Punishment is a more favorite book of mine, but I don't know. Lord of the Rings is also like a favorite book of mine. Can you actually ever choose truly what your very favorite book of all time is if you are an avid reader? I feel like you can't. So both of those are favorites of all time. But I think rereading Lord of the Rings was a much more beautiful and powerful experience for me than rereading Crime and Punishment. So if we're going to rank them, number 3 for me was actually The Two Towers, which is shocking because The Two Towers is my favorite movie of the trilogy. But again, it's still like a top of the year. So I really, really loved it. Number 1 is Fellowship of the Ring. And the reasoning for that is I love all the time at the beginning of the book that we spend in the Shire. It is a really, really slow beginning to this epic quest. But Return of the King is my all-time favorite. It is my number 1 book that I read this year out of the classics that I read. It is just so deeply powerful. You know, if you know anything about The Lord of the Rings, is that there is a ring that they're trying to get rid of because it's a ring that the evil Lord Sauron, if he has access to it, he'll be able to control so many people and just have so much power that he should not have. And so the whole quest to destroy the ring, the culminating moment of that doesn't happen at the end of Return of the King. It happens more like in the first quarter or first third. And the rest of the book is the fallout of what happens after that. There's such great discussions there talking about how war really affects people. And there's so many beautiful spiritual parallels. I'd always recognize the parallels of Gandalf and how he's a very Christ-like figure throughout the entirety of the trilogy. But Return of the King really helped me to see how much of a Christ figure Aragorn is, because oh my gosh, just such powerful and moving moments. And the end of the book totally made me not just cry, but cry. Like I didn't just get just a little bit teared up. Like I was very, 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 very much crying. Anyways, this is my ranking of all of the classics that I read in 2024. And again, if you talk to me on a different day, there might be quite a few that are flip-flopped. I'd love to hear from you in the comments down below. If you have any thoughts on these books, I always love hearing your thoughts. And I'd also love to hear from you. What are some of your favorite classics that you read in 2024? Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please hit like and also subscribe so you can continue to see more bookish content from me. And I will see you again tomorrow for another one of the 12 Days of Christmas.